Hello, everyone, and welcome. My name is Alexandra Bell, and I'm the president and CEO of the Bulletin, the Atomic Scientist. We at the Bulletin are committed to bringing you up-to-date and informed information related to global existential risks, and there is no doubt the dangers posed by the war with Iran will require global attention and your concern. On Saturday, February 28th, the United States and Israel launched a coordinated air and missile campaign inside Iran, targeting Iranian military, nuclear-related infrastructure, and leadership. As President Trump announced the operation, he encouraged the people of Iran to rise up against the current government. In his remarks today, he said this operation will continue for at least 4 to 5 more weeks. Things are evolving quickly, but we know the following. The attacks inside Iran killed the supreme leader, Ayatollah Ali Khamenei, alongside other key regime leaders. A 3-person leadership council has been announced as interim leadership in Iran. More than 500 Iranians have been killed, according to the Red Cross Red Crescent. The highest civilian casualties so far were found in southern Iran from a likely missile strike on a girls' elementary school, though the source of the strike remains unconfirmed. Iran has retaliated against countries with U.S. and Israeli presences, including the UAE, Oman, Bahrain, Iraq, Kuwait, and Syria, and direct strikes on Israel. As of the last update from the Pentagon, 4 U.S. troops have been killed, and President Trump warned today that more casualties are likely. Members of Congress are calling for a war powers resolution vote, led primarily by Democrats, with some Republicans joining in as well, with many members stating they saw no intelligence that indicated an imminent Iranian threat to the U.S., its allies, or interests. As of now, commercial ships in the area are still moving through the Straits of Hormuz, but targeted attacks and threats of closure are ongoing. So today, we'll spend some time talking through this situation, and we'll be taking your questions from YouTube, so please put them in the chat. We're joined today by Kelsey Davenport, Director for Nonproliferation Policy at the Arms Control Association. Kelsey is an expert on the nuclear and missile programs of Iran and North Korea and international efforts to prevent proliferation and nuclear terrorism. Dr. Jeffrey Lewis is also with us today. Jeffrey is a distinguished fellow at the Foreign Policy Research Institute and a distinguished scholar of global security at Middlebury College. He is an expert on arms control, nonproliferation, and disarmament. Thank you both for being here on such short notice, and let's begin. For both of you, given the forward flow of U.S. forces into the region, do you think kinetic strikes were inevitable, even with diplomatic efforts continuing? And what do you make of the timing of these strikes? So Jeffrey, let's start with you.
Well, people have choices, and so I don't want to imply that inevitable means that the administration couldn't have attempted to get a deal, but I do think that looking at the way the administration approached this was always, I think, the likely outcome. And I think it is important to distinguish the explanation the administration has given, which is largely focused on Iran's missile and nuclear programs, and the actual targeting, which is this is an effort to remove the Iranian leadership. And we can debate whether that's a good thing or a bad thing, but I think just as a factual matter, both Israel's strikes in June and this operation are not primarily about the WMD programs. They are primarily about removing the regime, with the WMD serving as a kind of justification for something that everyone can agree on.
Kelsey, your thoughts, and also any thoughts about the timing of the strike?
I mean, I certainly agree that residents have choices, but in assessing whether or not this was inevitable, I would look back to where negotiations between the United States and Iran were on Thursday, just 2 days before the United States and Israel decided to launch these strikes. Now, during these talks, which were mediated by the Omanis, the Iranians brought a proposal to put on the table. What's interesting about the Iranian proposal was that it did show that Iran was moving away from some of its more maximalist positions and putting on the table some options that I think, if the US had tested, could have proved the basis for an effective nuclear agreement. Now, I wouldn't expect the US to accept, just off the bat, this proposal that Iran put on the table. Iran did offer a pause in uranium enrichment, followed by the resumption of an enrichment program to fuel their reactors that I think was overinflated and overly ambitious. But again, it was demonstrating some flexibility. And rather than meet today for technical talks, which is what the US and Iran had originally agreed to do, the president decided to strike. Now, I do think that Israeli Prime Minister Netanyahu was, crucial in trying to influence President Trump's decision making on this. I think for Netanyahu, further strikes were likely inevitable, and he did what he could to ensure that the US was on board with him and to ensure that this diplomatic track, did not go anywhere, did not lead to a deal that he would view as contrary to Israel's interests. So I don't think that the strikes necessarily were inevitable, but I do think it is quite clear that the US did not exhaust its diplomatic outcomes to try to prevent the inevitability of the strikes.
Now, Kelsey, this marks the second time that the Trump administration has been involved in a diplomatic negotiation with Iran and then chose to strike. Does that make it more difficult to find diplomatic solutions in the future with the Iranians or any country for that matter?
Yeah, absolutely. And I'm glad you asked this question because we shouldn't view Iran in a vacuum here. I mean, we are entering an era where proliferation risks across the board are rising, where countries are losing confidence in the credibility of US extended deterrence commitments, where they're losing confidence in the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty to deliver security benefits. And now, this is another marker that the US cannot be trusted to negotiate over nuclear proliferation issues in good faith. And it's going to raise questions down the road if the US does enter into negotiations. Is this intended just to buy time, to allow the United States to put its military assets into position to utilize force rather than exhaust diplomatic efforts? So certainly, I think it's unsurprising that the Iranians were hesitant about whether or not the US was engaged in these negotiations in good faith. They were hesitant about the commitments that the US claimed that it would put on the table as part of the deal if Iran capitulated and dismantled its nuclear program. And that's only going to be amplified now because we've seen this not once, but twice when it comes to the US approach to the Iranian nuclear issue.
Now, Jeffrey, feel free to come in on that point, but I also want to ask you a little bit about the Trump administration said these strikes were necessary because Iran posed an imminent threat to the U.S. homeland, going so far as to intimate that the Iranians were developing an ICBM capability. So from an expert view, was that a threat, a potential ICBM capability in the hands of the Iranians?
Well, I mean, I think if we continue to attack them, yes, eventually there is going to be a response to that. So, there is a little bit of a chicken and egg question. What I would sort of back up and say is that Iran has for many years had the capacity to produce a missile that would strike the United States. We can see the progress on Iran rather's development of space launchers. And so that's a choice. Iran had, at least up until now, decided not to do that. The now late Supreme Leader had issued a policy judgment that Iran wouldn't pursue missiles with ranges of greater than 2,000 kilometers. And so I think we did have before us a kind of choice where we could have imagined a world in which we lived with one kind of Iranian missile program. But again, I will go back to what I said earlier. I think the fundamental dynamic that we can't underestimate is that for the Trump administration and their political allies, there is no agreement with Iran that is ultimately going to be acceptable to them. There is no armament that Iran could retain. And so I think this has always been fundamentally about regime change, with the technical details about the status of their missile program just being a kind of decoration. So, if there had been a serious concern about Iran's development of long-range missile capabilities, then there could have been a conversation about it, but it basically would have looked different than surrender and humiliate yourself. Because, rarely does that, as a negotiating strategy, produce an outcome that both parties can live with in a sustainable way for a long period of time.
So one of the things the Trump administration said was that this missile program was a shield for the nuclear program. At the same time, the Trump administration also maintained they obliterated nuclear forces in Iran last June with this strike. So, Jeffrey, what is the actual status of nuclear infrastructure in Iran?
Yeah, I mean, I would start by saying it is hard to tell. And one of the reasons it's hard to tell is that the Trump administration walked away from the nuclear agreement with the Iranians that provided access because after the strike in which declared facilities were very heavily damaged, the IAEA, the International Atomic Energy Agency, didn't have access that it would have had in the past. And so you don't really know what's happening because you don't really have much visibility. So what I think we can say is that the facilities that Iran had declared that were above ground were heavily damaged both for the missile production program and for the nuclear program. I think over the last year, we saw Iran rebuild the above ground facilities for its missile program. There's no legal reason that Iran's not allowed to have missiles. And so they rebuilt that capability. We did not see a similar rebuilding of the nuclear program. And that naturally leads to a question of, well, is that because there is no reconstitution happening? Or is that, again, because they have been attacked repeatedly? This has been driven underground. You know, it's not that I want to make out the Iranians as though they're the easiest country in the world to get along with. But I think we have to be realistic that says when you attack a country repeatedly, they're going to make some effort to deny you vision or visibility into what they're doing. So we know that the administration has said that Iran was reconstituting its ability to manufacture centrifuges. That information has just been asserted. We haven't gotten any evidence of that. But I think at the end of the day, we really don't know, right? This could be a situation like with Iraq in 2002, which I lived through, where the Bush administration said, well, if they don't have anything to hide, why won't they show us? And it turned out the thing they had to hide was their weakness. It could be a situation like I think North Korea in recent years, where they actually have plenty of capability, and that's precisely why they want to show us not because they're weak, but because they want to maintain the ability for these systems to survive. So again, I think we really don't know, and that's what makes this such a tremendous roll of the dice. Because if the strike does not succeed in removing the regime, which again, I think that's what this fundamentally is about, there remain thousands of people in Iran who are capable of reconstituting a program like this. The technology itself is decades old, and a vengeful Iran that survives this strike is likely, I think, to reach the same conclusion that North Korea reached, that China reached in the 1960s, and that the Soviet Union reached in the 1940s, which is it's a dangerous world out there with the United States, and it's better to be nuclear armed.
Kelsey, what are your thoughts on this, the status of what remains of the Iranian nuclear program, and whether or not these strikes might have actually driven them in the direction of once and for all deciding to acquire a nuclear capability?
Yeah, I mean, I agree with Jeffrey. I mean, I just add a few more points. First, the International Atomic Energy Agency's Board of Governors held an emergency meeting today called by the Russians on the Iranian situation. And IAEA Director General Grossi said very clearly that the agency does not see a structured program to manufacture nuclear weapons. And he has not only the agency's own satellite imagery and whatnot, but also information that's fed to the agency by its member states. Now, certainly, because IAEA inspectors have not had access to nuclear facilities in Iran that were bombed since June, there is a concern about where all of Iran's nuclear material is. What Iran might be trying to constitute at underground hardened facilities, because I agree with Jeffrey, a vengeful Iran is going to be more likely to weaponize. So again, a lot of uncertainties, but I think how I would characterize it is that Iran's nuclear program still posed a proliferation risk. They had the knowledge, they had the technologies, they have the materials, but it was not an imminent threat. There was no indication of a decision to weaponize. Satellite imagery does not suggest that Iran has tried to retrieve its nearly 440 kilograms of uranium enriched to 60% that's largely believed to be stored under the rubble at Isfahan. which is likely what it would want to do if it was trying to move to nuclear weapons as quickly as possible. So again, I think no clear evidence of a weaponization program. But I would also highlight that the June strikes demonstrate the limits of kinetic action in destroying Iran's nuclear program. And here I don't just mean the knowledge, which can't be bombed away, but the chairman of the Joint Chiefs, General Kane, told Congress in June that we didn't bother to use the massive ordnance penetrator against Esfahan because we didn't think we could destroy it, because it's that deeply buried. So again, I think clear indications that the U.S. cannot destroy this program by force. So irrespective of how this conflict turns out, whether Trump ends the war because of political pressure, whether there is some type of negotiated ceasefire, or whether or not there's regime change, there's still going to be a proliferation risk that the United States is going to have to address. And the United States is still going to have to think through what the negotiated terms are of a deal that would ensure that Iran's program is limited and monitored to reduce that proliferation risk going forward. Because my concern, again, I think echoing something that Jeffrey said, is that there is going to be greater interest. There's going to be further drivers pushing Iran towards weaponization, no matter how this conflict ends, because of the nature through which it started.
Now, Jeffrey, what can we read into Iran's retaliation so far? What does it suggest about their capacity going forward? And have we learned really anything new about the military capabilities of the U.S., Israel, and Iran through what we've seen over the past 4 days?
Yeah, I think anytime that there's a widespread violence like this, you learn a lot about the capabilities that both sides have. I think the sides themselves learn. I think what we've discovered is that the Iranians militarily were remarkably weak. They had air defenses that don't defend. They have organizational structures that don't seem very efficient. Just the way that we have seen so many Iranian missiles destroyed, which was very different than, for example, the Gulf War in 1991, is in 1991, at the beginning of the conflict, Saddam sent his Scuds out of the bases so that they would be hard to find. In Iran, they seem to just hang out in their tunnels until the war starts, and then they emerge only to be targeted. So, I think what we're seeing is that the Iranian posture and capabilities were not nearly what the Iranians, I think, led others to believe, or perhaps what they themselves believed. I think we're also seeing a lot of US and Israeli capabilities. In particular, we're seeing a lot of Israeli emphasis on air-launched ballistic missiles. And so there is a sense, I think, in which we're getting a glimpse of future warfare here. By the way, I would pause and just observe, I think a lot of what we're seeing, which should not be encouraging, and I know we're not great about thinking of second order effects of our actions. We tend to play we tend to play this as though it's a one move checkers game. But the Iranian capabilities would have been good enough if they had been nuclear armed. Iran was able to deliver some payloads on targets, but they were not good enough because they were conventionally armed, and so a small number of Iranian missiles surviving was insufficient, I think, from their perspective. So I think one of the things I would be very alarmed by looking at this conflict is the degree to which you really would look at this and think a conventional missile force is likely not a very effective deterrent. And so again, the people who seem to have gotten this right are going to look like the Soviets, the Chinese, the North Koreans. And so I think we are authoring a world in which a lot of countries are going to think very long and hard about nuclear weapons because of the choices that we've made.
Kelsey, thoughts to add there? And also we got a question from YouTube coming back to something that you said about work that would have to be done to secure Iranian nuclear materials no matter what. What actor, national or multilateral, should try to secure Iran's nuclear materials and technologies if the regime does collapse?
Yeah, thanks. So first of all, I just want to go back to the question you posed to Jeffrey and add a few points. I also think it's worth pointing out not just how Iran has waged conflicts and what it says about their capabilities, but also how the shift in their response in June to how they've responded to this conflict shows a change in mindset. And I think in June, when Iran responded to the US and Israeli strikes, they showed remarkable restraint. And I mean that with all due respect to the lives that were lost, in that conflict. But they did not throw everything they had at the United States and Israel. And I think coming into this conflict, they realized the limits, of that strategy and that there was no benefit to restraint. So I think we are going to continue to see Iran escalate and even escalate asymmetrically, in its response this time around because of the lessons it learned or perceives to have learned, from the June strikes. I also think, again, building off of something that Jeffrey said about how these conflicts have demonstrated some of Iran's weaknesses and the limits of reliance on conventionally armed ballistic missiles. I mean, to me, that just directly undermines the Trump administration's claims that Iran's ballistic missiles posed this existential threat. That we couldn't live with an Iran that produces these missile systems. We've been living with an Iran that had produced these missile systems for decades, and there have been no changes in my mind over the last 6 months that have been so significant that they've provided Iran with enough new capabilities that all of a sudden these systems are a threat. So I would just put that out there on the ballistic missile front. Finally, to your question on the importance of securing materials. I mean, it is not the International Atomic Energy Agency's job, to go into a conflict zone and secure materials. But at the same time, I think the single most important focus for the international community, if this conflict, comes to a conclusion, is to try to get the IAEA back into Iran, to begin to account for the materials, to begin to assess what remains, both to prevent any miscalculation or misinformation about future Iranian intentions that could provoke another conflict, but also to begin to develop baselines and inventories that will be necessary to inform a future agreement. So I think the International Atomic Energy Agency is going to be critical here in a post-conflict scenario to try to secure the nuclear program no matter the outcome. Now, if we end up in a scenario where we have regime implosion, where there is regime change, where Iran becomes so internally destabilized that there is a real risk that material is diverted, that it is stolen, that there's an interest by non-state actors to try to acquire materials and technology, to try to recruit scientists with weaponization relevant expertise. I mean, who goes in then? I mean, I think there's going to be a lot of pressure on the United States to put boots on the ground, which is something that, I mean, we've heard mixed things from the Trump administration about their interest or whether or not, they're willing to do that. But, I'm not sure, maybe the Israelis would think that they would try to go in, perhaps, secure and remove the 60% enriched uranium. I'm not sure who else would be willing to do that. There are certain countries and actors who I wouldn't want going in, looking at what's at some of these facilities, possibly removing it. So what that highlights for me is that there is a real nuclear security risk. There's a real nuclear terrorism risk to Trump's kind of regime change objective that I have not heard the administration acknowledging, and I have not heard the administration discussing whether or not they have a strategy if we were to get to that point. So I think the nuclear security issue is a real concern that could be exacerbated in the weeks to come.
Yeah. Thanks for that, Kelsey. Jeffrey, to you, that's actually a question we got on YouTube, is how secure is the existing nuclear material in Iran right now? Is there a concern it could be diverted while forces are focused elsewhere?
I mean, we just don't know where that material is. I mean, I have heard U.S. officials express just incredible levels of confidence that the facility at Isfahan was where the material was located, and that it was so heavily damaged that it is entombed in rock. And I don't know how one would know that or say that with any confidence. And I can pretty confidently say, having looked at decades of declassified intelligence estimates, those kinds of details are precisely the ones that people get wrong all the time. The Kennedy people in the Cuban Missile Crisis were absolutely convinced that there were no Soviet nuclear weapons in Cuba and that they could invade if they chose. And they were wrong about that. There were. And so I think there is a real lack of humility about how little we know. I am not worried about the diversion of material in the sense of a terrorist group acquiring it, because it needs to be further enriched. One could make a bomb with it, but it needs to be further enriched really to be what you'd like, and it needs to be converted to metal. But I do think we, over the long run the risk of losing any ability to see what's happening in Iran. And so, I think they have pushed all their chips in on a regime change strategy with zero plan for what comes next and no idea of who will take power in Iran. I mean, I think they have this. I worry it is a replay of the greeted as liberators problem we had in Iraq, where we thought, well, people really hate Saddam, so they'll be really happy to see us. Sometimes the answer is, we don't like that guy and we really don't like you. So we could well end up with a new Iranian regime that does not like us, that has learned the lesson from this, that says you must be very well armed. And if they're a little bit better about operational security than this government has been, they may well be able to cross that nuclear threshold without us knowing it. And that, to me, is just one of the things I'm so frustrated about this approach is I think they believe that they're going to knock this government down and then a miracle is going to happen. And so I guess you have to believe in miracles.
On that note, we've been talking a lot about what's happening in Iran. Let's shift to what's happening here in the States. Kelsey, can you talk a little bit about the U.S. Congress's reaction to this, including the war powers debate, which has been a long-running feature of tension between the legislative and executive branches?
Sure. I mean, I think in the domestic political constituency, the factionalization that we've seen emerge, post strikes is about what's to be expected. I mean, there has been an effort, led by, several members of Congress, most notably Senator Tim Kaine, kind of reestablish that Congress has the authority, and only Congress has the authority to declare war. And I think we could see a vote, I think, on Wednesday, possibly, on a war powers resolution, a mirror bill in the House that would assert that Congress has not declared war and try to limit what President Trump can be doing in Iran. Unfortunately, I think despite the fact that this is very clearly a war, despite some administration officials' attempts to say that it's not a war, I'm concerned that these resolutions may not pass because of the decades of animosity between the United States and Iran, and because of the influence of certain factions within the Israeli lobby that make it very difficult to stand up to legislation that's perceived as contrary to Israeli security interests. And we've already seen a number of members of Congress coming out basically sort of blaming Iran for creating this situation by refusing to negotiate a deal in good faith, by refusing to give up its nuclear program, by refusing to allow the IAEA inspectors back in. And just to make clear, I mean, Iran bears its share of the blame for how this crisis has been prolonged over the past several years. Iran's failure to implement its legally required safeguards agreement after June is a big problem. I mean, Iran's refusal to engage in direct talks with the United States contributed to the diplomatic, stalemate. But the idea that the president can conduct a preventive illegal war simply because we don't like Iran is absurd. And I think the fact that we're not seeing more members of Congress come out to try to reassert Congress's power to declare war and to try to check the president is alarming and is only going to empower the president to feel like he has more latitude to continue these strikes, and possibly expand kind of the scope of U.S. objectives. So the lack of accountability is alarming, is depressing, and I fear it's going to be enabling.
No, and I'm glad you brought up the issue of negotiating in good faith that may have been limited over the past couple of years, but the Iranians did negotiate in good faith, along with the United States and countries around the world, to develop the Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action, often called the Iran deal, that was, proven to be helping to reduce the nuclear arsenal. Of course, the Trump administration, President Trump in his first term, withdrew from that agreement, effectively kickstarting this crisis that we're now seeing. Now, Jeffrey, you've alluded a couple times to it being deja vu all over again in terms of U.S. interventions in the Middle East. What is your take on the reaction from the U.S. public so far? And do you think there's an appetite to engage in another boots on the ground intervention in that region?
Yeah, I mean it's very hard to tell. I don't think that there is an enormous appetite for an Iraq-style occupation. I mean, I would observe that having lived through the original one, there wasn't really an enormous appetite for it in that moment. I mean, there was an enormous anger and fear and grief that had emerged from 9/11, and I think that created the political conditions that allowed America to get into that situation. But I think once we were in it, I think you saw that while the American public never turned against the troops who had to carry out that very difficult and thankless mission, they certainly turned against the Bush administration. I know he eked out a second term, but it was the midterms, I think, demonstrated there was a real desire for a different course. So no, I think it would be an enormous political misjudgment of the president to do that. I would say, though, there are two things that I think our public discourse doesn't capture, and they are important. I mean, the first is that we are very utilitarian or instrumentalist in the way that we talk about these conflicts. If the outcome is good for us, then I think we decide that that's good, right? And I think that in doing so, we tend to give short shrift to the sacrifice that people make and to the enormous loss of life and harm that we are doing, right? And those may not matter to most people in some kind of calculation about whether the war advances our interests. But some of us believe in right and wrong. And some of us think that that's an important part of being a human being. The second thing is, I think war has a very corrosive effect on one's civil society and one's own democratic situation. And I don't think it's an accident that we're experiencing such severe democratic backsliding in the United States when it's been followed by 20 years of forever wars. And so, on the one hand, I think the public has very little appetite for doing more of this. I think there is a genuine kind of general awareness, but I wouldn't describe it as a real full accounting for all the costs that are to come.
Kelsey, the consultation with U.S. allies seems to have been extremely limited in terms of, coordinating on this particular set of strikes. Do you think this war is going to further damage the U.S. relationship with its European allies and other allies abroad?
I think in the long term, this conflict is going to play into what we've already seen in the erosion of confidence in the U.S. as a partner and ally, and the erosion of confidence in U.S. extended deterrence and security commitments. That being said, I think the U.S. allied response to the U.S. strikes has been extremely disappointing. Perhaps with the exception of Spain, which seems to be the only country that has shown some moral courage and has recognized that these strikes have a detrimental effect on international law and a detrimental effect on the broader non-proliferation regime. I mean, again, the Security Council convened an emergency session to discuss this, just yesterday. And the European members of the Council were largely circumspect in their criticism. Again, they appeared to be trying to put the burden on Iran for failing to, negotiate, or what I would say for failing to completely capitulate to Trump's, demands. And for its repression of the protest movement in January, which certainly was devastating, was repressive, was atrocious. But again, not a justification for military strikes, a month and a half later. So again, I think this plays into kind of the broader erosion of confidence in U.S. leadership and U.S. security guarantees, even if we aren't seeing some of the direct and pointed criticism against the United States, from key allies, particularly in Europe.
Hmm. Jeffrey, feel free to add there, but we've got another question from YouTube, sort of talking about, we've got allies in that region too, and we got a question: Iran is attacking neighboring countries with U.S. bases. Is this a good strategy on Iran's part?
I mean, I do not think the Iranians are, at least this particular regime, has been particularly good at strategy. The reality is that Iran is exposed to this because it has few allies, and most of the countries in the region dislike it intensely. And so, it isn't a conflict like this is always very difficult because the regime itself in Iran is not particularly likable. The question is, what is the effect of our action on the outcomes that are going to be in Iran, right? Are we making a better Iranian future more likely or less likely, right? And I just tend to think that absent some very clear and well thought through plan, huge amounts of violence. We are really great at breaking things. We are incredible at breaking things. I have no doubt that if the United States government wants to, it can break the Iranian regime. Where we fall short is this ability to build something, right? And so what I am consistently concerned about is I think Iran's neighbors loathed Iran. They are quite happy to see this happening to Iran. They are willing, I think, to, for a while, take this level of punishment. But the security situation that we are building in the Middle East, it does not seem to me that we have some plan for a stable, secure Middle East in which the people who live there have good and fulfilling lives, and it participates fully in a global economy that provides opportunity and growth, right? I think we are instead just doubling down on this continuous pattern of violence. And so, again, no one will miss the Iranian regime if it falls, but that's no guarantee that we will like what comes later.
Now, Kelsey, President Putin condemned these attacks, apparently without any irony, given their ongoing illegal assaults on Ukraine. But can you talk? We got a question from YouTube. Can we talk a little bit about Iran's relationship with Russia, Russian support for the regime over the years, including their ballistic missile programs and the way that drones are being used by each country?
Yeah, I think that Russia's response to the U.S. and Israeli strikes in June and the response to this current round of strikes, is not surprising, and I think just provides further evidence that the Iranian-Russian relationship is not symbiotic, right? I mean, the Russians are using Iran like a leech, where they're extracting what they want. When they were getting support for their drone program, some support for drone manufacturing, that was advantageous to them. But we're not seeing kind of reciprocal Russian commitments to the security and defense within Iran. And this should surprise nobody, given how we saw the Russians treat the Syrians, right? So I think that kind of looking, big picture, I would be very surprised if the Iranians thought this time around that they were going to get more support from the Russians beyond the kind of rhetorical condemnation of these strikes. So I just don't see, Russia, doing much concretely to try to assist Iran, to try to resupply Iran, to try to, help Iran, with its defenses going forward. I mean, that's just not in Russia's strategic interests, and Putin is not going to go out on a limb for Iran here.
Hmm. Now, Jeffrey, China also has a relationship with Iran. So can you speak to that, but also speak to, the idea that China was watching closely and continues to watch closely Russia's invasion of Ukraine with interest in terms of a potential future action toward Taiwan. Is this the case with what's happening in Iran and potentially as well with the U.S. attack on Venezuela?
Yeah, I think it becomes very easy to imagine foreign leaders as these, I think, incredibly sophisticated and strategic people. And, my sense is that that's generally not the case, that people who find themselves in a position of power have a certain amount of cunning, but you can't really afford to be an expert in all of the things that you do. Xi Jinping has to run China. He has to make decisions about the country's macroeconomic policy. He has to run security policy internally. He also has to have some strategic ideas. And so I tend to think world leaders know a few things that tend to inform their entire worldview. And I think the thing that we've noticed about Xi Jinping is he thinks it's terribly important to be strong. And I truly don't think that there is probably a lot more than that to the way he looks at the world. And so my suspicion is he looks at Iran and he sees a weak country that is being subject to predation. The Chinese Communist Party has a variety of arguments about how China itself would be subject to that same kind of treatment if it weren't strong and didn't have nuclear weapons. And so I think the Chinese will look at their situation and think, aha, well, that's why one has to continue huge levels of defense investment. And yes, their military will learn some small lessons. But I think the big takeaway for Xi Jinping is going to be that strength matters. So it's not necessarily, I think, the case that you get this huge security benefit from doing this to Iran because you're going to intimidate or impress others. What you will do, I think, and I think we will experience this, is I think we will have provided more justification for the people in China who want to take the hardest line, who want to do the most investment in new capabilities, for the people who have the darkest views of the United States. And again, these kinds of costs, I think, are very hard to price in, right? It's very easy to say the supreme leader is dead. There is now some different future in Iran. That's very direct. But the opportunity cost of your ability to head off the kind of long-term competition that I think that we are stumbling into with China, that's very hard to price. But I don't think anyone in China is going to walk away from this conflict and think, wow, we really should talk to the Americans because they seem pretty reasonable.
Kelsey, there's another question from YouTube. There's talk of the U.S. arsenal being depleted by this military action, hence the limited time span that the president pointed out. What's your take? Is this going to affect our ability to send supplies to Ukraine and also to our overall defense stockpile?
Well, what I have looked most closely at is the relationship between Iran's production of missiles and UAVs and the U.S. production of interceptors for missile defenses in the region. And here, I mean, again, recognizing that there is a lot that is hard to determine about the Iranian program and what Iran was able to rebuild in the past 6 months. But there does appear to be a mismatch that favors Iran in terms of production. that Iran has been able to restock its missiles, its UAVs at a faster rate than the U.S. has been able to produce, THAAD interceptors, SM-3 interceptors, and that even if the U.S. had moved, half of its stockpiles of these interceptors to the region, if they're shooting multiple interceptors at incoming projectiles, some estimates say that the U.S. could run out of these THAAD interceptors, within 10 days to 3 weeks. Could run out of SM-3 interceptors, within 4 to 5 weeks. Again, a lot of this depends on what Iran is kind of firing at the United States, at U.S. assets. But I think Iran has made clear that, again, it's not afraid to escalate, asymmetrically. And that it is also kind of bedding down for this to be a longer drawn out conflict and is ready for that. So I'm afraid that in the kind of missiles versus interceptors, the longer this conflict drags out, the more it is going to enable Iran to penetrate U.S. and Israeli defenses and inflict more damages, including civilian casualties in the conflict in the weeks ahead.
Jeffrey, anything to add on what this is doing to U.S. capabilities?
Well, I mean, I do think it's just important to keep in mind that war is ferociously expensive. The U.S. ground-based mid-course interceptor, which is the primary missile defense interceptor that would be used for an ICBM, is like $100 million an item, right? So these numbers are just almost impossible to fathom. And so I think, it becomes very easy to sort of imagine this as though it is like a game of Risk or something, where you're just constantly churning out these new capabilities on a regular basis. But these are incredibly expensive capabilities, and it's no surprise that you've seen the United States on a number of times. It looks like the magazine depth gets much lower, right? And maybe in the near term, that's not a particularly big deal because we're just fighting Iran. But there is, I think, an open question of how many capabilities do you need to hold back in case there is a conflict in the Indo-Pacific or there is an escalation in Europe. And so it really, I think, is the case that particularly for missile defense interceptors, which are very expensive, and there is a limited production of them, if you look at some of the open source videos, as we do, you see the United States and Israel expending enormous numbers of interceptors, and there will just come a point at which there are no more. And that may happen in Iran after the Iranians are out of missiles, and so it may be fine. But then that is a global drawdown that one will need to replace. So there are again, it is, I think, so easy to calculate the first move. It is like computers playing chess. For the longest time, they were not as good as people because each move introduces so many additional complications. Quickly, you go beyond what's capable of being calculated. So you don't necessarily know how you're losing the game, but you may very well end up in a position, we may end up in a position that we do not like because we can't think about the third, fourth order effects of the decisions we're making today.
So we got another question from YouTube asking about the chances that Iran decides to use a radiological weapon, being more accessible. The questioner posits, uranium and plutonium, but as you know, a radiological weapon would most likely use a different sort of radiological material that is more radioactive, more corrosive. But is that a reason to be concerned? Potential dirty bomb attacks, if not other potential WMD. Is there any reason to believe, chemical or biological attacks would be a route that the Iranians might take in retaliation? So Kelsey, let's start with you.
I am less concerned about Iran resorting to a dirty bomb attack or a chemical weapons attack, not necessarily because they don't have the capabilities, but because I think if Iran escalates to use that type of weapon against a U.S. asset, against a country in the region, against Israel, it's going to risk opening the door to a similar strike in response. And I hate to say it, but with this president, I'm not sure we could rule out that Trump would not use a nuclear weapon in response to some type of radiological, dirty bomb. So I don't see what strategic benefit that would necessarily provide Iran. And also, dirty bombs, I mean, generally, when you think of a state, or more likely a non-state actor that would deploy a dirty bomb, it's generally more to spark fear, to create chaos, not because the radioactive, contamination spread by a dirty bomb is going to result in a massive amount of casualties, or deter any further counterstrikes. So because it would be, I think, very risky in terms of the escalation domino that type of weapon could produce, and because I think it's hard to see how that would serve some of Iran's aims going forward, I think it's less likely that we would see the Iranian armed forces utilize that. Now, in the event of, again, sort of regime implosion, greater chaos, is there a risk of a dirty bomb being used inside Iran? That, I think, is actually the more likely scenario. If you have, one faction, trying to, sow fear, create chaos, to capitalize on it for domestic political reasons, I think that would be the more likely scenario.
Jeffrey, any thoughts about a potential dirty bomb or other WMD?
Yeah, like Kelsey, it's very hard to do anything with a dirty bomb other than create panic. Chemical weapons are a usable capability that might, if delivered properly, kill quite a few people. We don't really know much about the state of Iran's chemical weapons. Iran was subject to chemical weapons attacks. There are persistent rumors Iran has retained a chemical weapons stockpile, but we don't have really any clear evidence of that. I would say two things. One is that the United States policy is to the United States has a security assurance that it would not use nuclear weapons in response to a chemical attack, but that requires that a state be in compliance with its nuclear non-proliferation obligations. So that was very pointedly written to exclude Iran, North Korea, and Syria at the time. I think from the Iranian perspective, does not matter who the US president is, a use of chemical weapons would probably be a very, very last resort kind of scenario, one in which the regime felt that it was facing existential danger. And even then, that would require it to have in advance made the plans to do so, have given those capabilities to units, and have units that are willing to do them. So, I can't rule out in extremis that a collapsing Iranian regime might do something like that. But I do think that that's probably pretty unlikely.
So we've talked a lot about the current state of threat, but not a lot about how we get out of this. We have a question from our audience about what are the immediate diplomatic off-ramps? Are there any off-ramps to be had? And are diplomatic options harder to achieve since the U.S. Uses intermediaries and doesn't talk directly to the Iranians? Do they need to talk directly to the Iranians? Jeffrey, we'll start with you.
Yeah. Look, I don't think I truly, one of the reasons I'm alarmed by this is I truly believe this administration does not want to talk to the Iranians. It does not want an agreement. The only agreement that this administration wants is a sort of humiliating, complete and abject surrender of the sort that I think would quickly be followed by the Iranian regime falling. So I think the degree to which we have seen negotiations have been essentially, here is the surrender document, take it or leave it. And then when the Iranians make a counter proposal, because it's not a surrender document, we ignore it. Right? I truly don't think that they have any theory of the case that involves the Islamic Republic remaining in charge in Iran. And again, that's something that gives me quite a bit of pause, because if they fail to achieve that goal, then they will be left with an Iran that is certainly weakened, but it will be revanchist, right? It will have a long list of grievances, and I think a profound sense that it was wrong to strike a nuclear deal with the United States, and the North Koreans were right not to. And so we may find ourselves in the position that some of us warned about at the beginning, where you end up in a situation where we have now struck Iran twice in less than a year, because it is like mowing the lawn. You have created this implacable hostility and desire to have a nuclear weapon, and you must continually strike them over and over and over again in order to prevent them from achieving that goal. And so, there just, I think, are not real clear pathways for this team in the White House that don't involve the fall of the Iranian government. It would be nice if they had some plan for what comes next. But again, I lived through the original Iraq, and those plans are usually exist perhaps in people's hearts, maybe in their heads, but never on paper.
Kelsey?
Yeah, I mean, if anyone tells you they know how this is going to end or how this is going to be resolved, I mean, it's impossible to say right now. I mean, I agree that the scenario that Jeffrey described, I think, is likely. A few other points I would make, though, is there are some indications that Iran has escalated its attacks and is targeting Gulf states in the hopes that if they reach sort of a pain intolerance level, they might pressure the United States to end this conflict. So there is, I think, a possible, it's worth kind of watching kind of those Gulf channels to see, if the Gulf states are going to kind of push for a ceasefire here. I also have questions about China going forward if this is a long-term, drawn-out conflict. I don't think China wants to see the US and Iran develop a close relationship by any means. I think there are some strategic benefits for China for the US getting bogged down in the Middle East. At the same time, a broader regional conflict could, damage and negatively affect certain Chinese interests in the region. And we saw, China sort of mediate between Saudi Arabia and Iran in the past. So they do have, some familiar kind of with these diplomatic spaces. Would they get involved? I think that's another question. I mean, the other scenario I think I would raise is the longer this conflict drags out, I think the more pain it could inflict domestically on the US in terms of economic costs, oil prices going up, further loss of lives. Does it get to the point where it's just politically less feasible for Trump to continue this conflict? And given the fact that he has not defined a consistent objective for what these strikes are trying to achieve, and just given Donald Trump's past character, he's not going to care about changing the narrative or ensuring that these objectives are met before he declares victory and stops. So I do wonder if that would kind of create an opening for the US to de-escalate, while claiming victory, again, because of those costs at home. But irrespective of how this ends, I think it's just worth emphasizing again, the nuclear proliferation risk is going to remain. How quickly Iran could weaponize, under what conditions, all of that is going to be unclear. But the US is going to have to address this at some point. And I think we've seen that, mowing the grass, while an option, I mean, it's risky. I mean, that depends on intelligence. There's a risk things could get missed. You know, it's not viable in the long term, and it's extremely costly. So again, I think, you know, we need to be thinking diplomatically about a longer term solution. And I think it's unfortunate, you know, we're not seeing this administration, in my opinion, put any effort into, you know, a good faith, realistic plan for what, you know, an effective non-proliferation agreement or set of measures looks like.
Hmm. So we're about out of time, and I'm going to ask each of you to close us out uh, with a short message. We know the president really loves social media, posts there a lot. If you were guaranteed that the president would see your social media post on this, what advice would you give him about next steps? And I'll let you think about that for a moment and just let everybody watching know that the Bulletin is covering this topic on all of our platforms. We have in-depth articles posted on our site. We'll continue to update with explainers, perspectives on our social media accounts. We send 2 newsletters a week that are a great compilation of these products and a great way to stay up to date on these issues. So please sign up for that. So Jeffrey, what's your post?
I want to say something sarcastic. I mean, it's consider therapy, right? Like this is emotional, it is not rational, right? There is not, I think, any deep and profound thinking behind this, and ultimately, he won't be the one who has to deal with the consequences. So, you know, let's think about our life choices.
Kelsey?
Jeffrey is far better at social media than I am. I mean, I would say, you know, regime change is not an effective non-proliferation policy. It is not going to guarantee that Iran is never, ever, 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 you know, going to get, you know, a nuclear weapon.
Mm. Both good missives, and hopefully people will get the message. That's all the time we have for today. Really thanks to both Jeffrey and Kelsey for joining us on very short notice in order to get this information out as quickly as possible. This is an evolving story. As I said, we'll continue to cover it, and we'll certainly be coming back to great experts like you for more insights. So thank you for joining us, and hope to see you next time.